Day 950 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzie here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 653,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional 1,250 in the past day. Then as for hardware losses, so 5 tanks, 27 APVs, 27 artillery, and 1 air defense system. So headed across to the map and starting out in the Kursk direction, because as per the latest updates, there's reports of the AFU breaking through the Russian settlement of Vesoloy. This one is in the Glashkovsky district to the west. But just getting that one out of the way, because the real curiosity today was southeast of Sudzha, right in the district of Plkovo, where a large Russian offensive commenced but was repelled by Ukrainian military using FPV drones and artillery. However, the Russian counter-offensive operations here were stopped, at least in part, due to their own fortifications, their own build-ups themselves. That's right, the Russian tanks ran into their own anti-tank ditches, which would be bad enough on any day of the week, but perhaps made only more embarrassing by the fact that most of the tanks were turtle tanks. Now, the Russian army is sometimes referred to as performing military strategy right out of the World War II playbooks. But even the 1943 Battle of Kursk, the Soviet counterattack near Prokhorovka, was an event where their forces ran into an anti-tank ditch that they had also forgotten about. But back to 2024 we go, as for this location, Russia tried to flank Ukrainian positions in Plkovo with at least a company of armor and up to a company of light infantry, so around 10 tanks and about, in this case, 80 to 100 light infantry. That turned out to be quite the disaster, which likely, in this case, results from a lack of training and intelligence gathering. Then, also in Kursk, there was a fire at Rilsk. It's not clear exactly as to why, but may have been a target of the latest AFU UAV attack rounds on Russian military infrastructure. So possibly a depot, by the looks of it. Then also in Kursk, we saw some interesting footage of a Leopard 2 tank towing a T-72 from the battlefield, where this German-made tank receives a hit and the turret catches fire. However, the automatic fire suppression system suppresses the fire and enables the tank to continue the evacuation, and done so right past Russia's easily removable Dragon's Teeth. In fact, Kursk was quite busy most recently as a Russian BMP tried to attack Ukrainian positions but was hit by a grenade launcher. The vehicle in this case bogged down and eventually burned out. And also worthy of a look is Tetkino in the most western point of these incursion activities, where I'd keep your eye on this area as there has been a notable increase in the activity in this Tetkino triangle, as there has been a growing number of large craters on the Russian side of the border starting from September 15, likely caused by Ukrainian airstrikes and artillery. Now, Ukraine could form a third bridgehead in this area connecting the town to the east, which would then become an expanding problem for the Russian army. It's also something that one can firmly say is something that has certainly already been considered by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. However, they do tend to plan the timing of these events as perfectly as possible, like so many other military operations, as opposed to, say, Plkovo, waltzing right in, as the Russian army had done just most recently. Then on the map, and heading all the way down to Vuhledar in the southeast, because although there was no explicit changes on the map today, Russia did expand the grey area south to the town. And it is interesting how Russian sources state that soldiers of the AFU are quote-unquote mostly surrendering, which happens to lead me down the rabbit hole of trying to confirm these Russian claims, or this vast information space of Russian disinformation, which becomes a real time waster. But ultimately, Ukraine's armed forces can still defend Vuhledar, so long as they hold the supply line north of the city. And as for those Russian sources, well, in the very same sentence as the earlier example, they stated fully, quote, "Poorly trained new Ukrainian recruits mostly surrender." Which is on all three accounts not exactly an accurate picture, because firstly and secondly, Ukraine does not send poorly trained or new recruits to the toughest frontline defense positions. They're either in the rear or still training in Spain, the UK, Germany, and so on. Then to the last part about the claims for mostly surrendering. Well, the Russian army isn't exactly in the business all that much of taking surrendering Ukrainian soldiers. So instead of all that, we'll take a further zoom-in look at the actual realities on the ground, as the case looks to be such that Russian units are in the throes of attempting to seize and control a number of high-rise buildings to the very east of the town, where they would look to fortify those high-rise positions to use them as a new vector of attack. But if failing such initiatives as these, then they would likely simply revert back to their classic demolition strategy, where they are well known to just lay waste to an entire town, which is not exactly in line with the stated goal of liberating the territories of the Donbass and so forth. Then taking a look around on the map, because somewhere in the east we saw a Russian ground drone destroyed by an FPV strike of the AFU. Now, Russia does have these platforms, but are rarely on the scene, and are used in a somewhat limited or prototype capacity for about a year now. Then also on the map, we saw two armoured Russian vehicles destroyed together, creating quite the flame ball. Then also for some activities, and just in case you were wondering if the two-wheel army was still around, well, there is no shortage of these Russian biker units, who are always taking on fire when they get too close to the front. Then to take a look into Russian territories, where the events today were much more mild comparatively. Although, just to clarify, by mild I mean a hotel named Kyiv was burning in Dagestan, then a wild berries factory was burning to the ground 1,000 miles away in Altai Krai, which reportedly since then, the fire caught onto the small tanks behind it. Then in Russia, there was also a not yet disclosed fire of some description in Kursk, and then also a fire at the Salinger City housing estate in downtown Moscow. So, as I said, a very mild day otherwise for activities in Russia. Then headed across to some Ukrainian news updates, as Denmark has committed to providing approximately $629 million worth of funding for the purchase of weapons through Ukraine's defense industry. Of this amount, $434 million will come from frozen Russian assets. Earlier this year, Denmark financed a pilot project worth 50 million euros for 18 units of Ukrainian-made Bodana self-propelled howitzers, all of which have since been delivered to the Ukrainian army. But as for this latest military aid package, it's nice to see Russia pulling their weight a little bit in the financing of Ukraine's defenses. And though it is primarily using interest generated from frozen Russian assets, the day will come when Europe's collective hundreds of billions of euros worth of Russian frozen assets themselves will start to be used to fund a lot of activity against their own country. Then to some more Ukrainian hardware news, as Australia is seeking US approval to send its decommissioned M1A1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine following their replacement by newer M1A2 models. Washington's approval is required due to export regulations, but it's expected to be just formality at this stage. So Australia purchased 59 M1A1s in 2004, with the now 20-year-old tanks seeing relatively little use over the years in Australia due to the relatively peaceful environment and lack of large-scale armoured conflicts, which led to this small operational use during their service life. So Ukraine has received 31 of these Abrams tanks from the United States, meaning that this donation could see a doubling of Abrams in Ukraine in the not-too-distant future. Although technically speaking, with these figures, that could almost amount to a tripling. Then to one of my favourite parts, the Russian hardware updates. So here we see another example of a Russian howitzer, the D-30 of the 122mm Soviet caliber, without wheels or tyres. And being that it's not the first time, it appears that in some instances now that the Russian army is dealing with the shortage of tires. Then to some more Russian innovations, more Russian hardware. Because here we see an infield design of a Russian demining vehicle. Though realistically, it's just a buggy with a low-set bumper bar. And I somehow doubt it's gone through rigorous testing before deployment, where instead it will get some of that on-the-job experience. Then in some even more Russian hardware update news, because in light of ongoing shortages in Russian artillery, whether it be tires, barrels, or even 30,000 tons of destroyed ammunition recently, the latest makeshift monstrosity from Russia is this anti-submarine warfare RBU 6000 system, installed on top of either a T-62 or T-72 tank chassis. I don't know what to say, as this is not optimized for land-based operations due to its limited range and inability to effectively engage ground targets. The platform also lacks the necessary precision and firepower to serve as a credible artillery system. Its installation reflects more of a desperate attempt at repurposing obsolete hardware rather than a tactically sound enhancement. So essentially, Russian military storage warehouses find unused pieces of equipment and simply push them to the front line in the hope that their personnel can make some sort of use out of them. Though I do expect it will have some value as a sort of museum piece someday, if not destroyed by then. Then moving across, because with so much economy news coming out of Russia these days, I'll briefly run through a small bunch of these. So starting off, recent figures show that Russia's credit card spending in August reached a 2.5-year high. Well, that seems like quite a coincidence, given that Russia started getting heavy sanctions imposed on it almost exactly from that amount of time ago. Then in some more Russian economy news, Russia's military spending is set to rise dramatically in 2025, reaching $142 billion in US dollars, amounting to 6.2% of GDP, according to recent Bloomberg reports. This marks a 70% increase since 2023 and a staggering 300% rise since 2021, as the country prioritizes defense over internal social programs, which will be cut by 10%. And with all of this short-term military spending that lacks providing the Russian economy with long-term dividends, many economists now suggest that it's the only thing stopping Russia from entering into an immediate recession, which can only be held off for so long now. Then headed across to something a little bit lighter today. Now, we can't always play the role of our job description in life, and the same goes for top Ukrainian spy chief Bottleneck. Seen here acting in the capacity of a regular civilian doing some grocery shopping, and this is something you probably won't ever see Bottleneck's Russian counterpart doing. In fact, 2 out of the last 3 Russian spy chiefs died under mysterious circumstances, all whilst serving under Putin. And this might seem a little bit odd at first glance for some, but if you are arguably as paranoid as Putin, then if you can't trust your own spy chief, terminating their contract might not be enough for you. And there I go again, once in a while somehow turning a lighter segment accidentally into something not so light. So then we'll head across to a couple of funnies to round it all off for today, guys, both of which are probably anything but laugh out loud funnies. So for the first one, a man from St. Petersburg in Russia shared his emotions after the purchase of his brand new Chinese car almost cost him his life. So in the background narration, he said that the cheap Chinese self-driving car saw an obstacle that didn't exist on the road, leading it to swerve into an actual obstacle in the street. And so events like these are arguably as a direct result of Russia's expansionist foreign policy, as I like to call it, as 7 out of the top 10 Russian car sales in the country are now of Chinese make. Cheap, not rigorously tested, and brand names you've never heard of before. More and more we see Russia is turning into a Chinese province. Then to a second not so funny to round it all off for today, guys. So Russian propagandist Martin suggests Russians buy apartments in occupied Donetsk and Makivka of the Donbas region. as they are cheaper than in Moscow. And the further explanation he gave for this suggestion, because people are complaining that mortgages in Russia are super expensive now, with the average interest rate at 22%. 22%! This is a country slowly destroying itself from the inside out. Martin also offered the solution of there being plenty of other places outside of Moscow for purchase of some real estate, which would realistically include a lot of places that don't have existing or even sufficiently maintained infrastructure, not the least of which is superior Western indoor plumbing. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks again for watching. Please continue to like, comment. Thanks once again for all of the support. It really does help out, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers.